but it's really good to have our kids. All right, so this past week I had a conversation with one of my kids, and my kids now are all adults, and it's kind of crazy. It seemed like not too long ago, my kids were running out the doors to head downstairs, but now they're all adults, and I was having a conversation with one of them, and we were talking about life and how life is full of obstacles. Life is full of challenges and difficulties, and you can expect it every day of your life. And I said something like, it's one of the things that we need to learn. Life has its challenges. Some of them are, they're minor challenges, and others of them are huge, huge obstacles. And as we do life and deal with these challenges and these obstacles, undoubtedly there comes hardship, and there comes difficulty, which leads to emotions that we then have of sometimes of pain, of rejection, of deep sorrow. And this is just life. And the quicker and the sooner that we learn this, that life has its obstacles, life has its challenges, the better off we are. As I have kind of been thinking about that, there are a number of people that I've interacted with over the past 2 weeks that have been experiencing hardships and obstacles, not just the adult child I was talking with. People who are connected to our church. And so I'm just going to rattle through a bunch of these. And I'm just going to start with physical issues, right? This is one of the areas that we experience hardship and obstacles. There's physical issues that we deal with. And so on Friday, there were 55 of our youth and 20 adults who headed to Refreshing Mountain for a week-long retreat. So, we have a whole bunch of people who are away this morning who are enjoying time of connecting with God and with each other. 55 youth and 20 adults. Now, not 20 adults went, 2 stayed behind, because on Friday, these 2 adult leaders experienced difficult physical issues. One, significant neck pain, took the individual to the doctor, and another, cellulitis, took him to the hospital. And then earlier in the week, I'd received a text from an individual who said, "Would you be willing to reach out to my friend? My friend has a grandson. The grandson is only 1 month old, and the grandson has had seizures and has had a stroke. And the grandparents and the parents, they don't know what's going to happen and if this child is going to live. And I know that you've lived through hard things with children. Would you be willing to reach out to this family?" 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call from a grandfather who said, "Would you please pray for my granddaughter? My granddaughter was at school and she passed out. They don't know what's going on. She's taken to the hospital." Last week, there was a family who was a part of our small group, and the mom, she was on her way leaving the library, and she saw a driver pulled out in front of her, and she hit the driver on the driver's side of the door. She's pregnant. She's rushed to the hospital to make sure everything was okay. The driver of the vehicle was an older gentleman. He got out and appeared to be fine, but died the next day. I talked to somebody this morning who was coming through the doors who said, "The month of November was really hard for me. I found myself in the hospital." And I'm not even through all of my list. There are so many of us, spouses dealing with spouses who have cancer, people within their family, a father, a daughter-in-law, cancer. Just on and on and on, right? This is life. Life, to live is to deal with hardships. To live is to deal with challenges, and those challenges, they create emotional things for us. They create questions in our mind. It brings all kinds of challenge to us. And not only physically, though, but there's emotional obstacles too, right? So there's fear, there's anxiety over what is to come tomorrow. There's decisions that need to be made. Decisions related to jobs. Big transition decisions. Do I stay in this country or do I move and leave? I know there's a family in our church that's considering that. It's a huge decision. Young people who are dealing with other young people. high school students who are being bullied. That's an issue. I know that Pastor Joe is working with our students, some students within our own youth group who are experiencing this. Not only is it within that dynamic, but then there's relational issues, right? And so there's spouses who are having difficulty getting along. And we say things and we hurt each other and we tear each other down, and this creates questions in our heart and questions in our mind, and we ache and we hurt. Some are living through divorce, others are living through separation. I received a text last week from somebody within our church and said, hey, I have a coworker of mine who just confided with me that she's newly married and was going through her husband's phone and found sexually explicit content. They've only been married a couple of months. Is there any resources that you have? Is there anything you can do to help this couple? This past week. Maybe somebody listening online, or maybe even one of you who are here this morning, undoubtedly, sexually explicit material is something that we all deal with. And if you are struggling with this and you are in a place like this young man is in and you are stuck, don't stay there hidden. Come talk to me. Say something. There is help to help you move forward. But these kinds of things, whether it be physical, whether it be emotional, whether it be relational, these kinds of things happen in life. And they create all kinds of hurt and pain. Think of this young wife, this young husband, what they're dealing with. Broken trust, all kinds of junk. This is life. This is life. And the question is this, is how do we in life deal with those hardships and those obstacles? We're in this series called Faithful and Faithless Times. And one of the increasing ways that people are dealing with these kinds of obstacles is to choose the route of faithlessness. Right? And so last week we looked at statistics that indicate that the United States surveys, Pew Research conducted, shows that the increase in the number of people who have no faith doubled in the past 6 to 8 years. And that had doubled over the past prior 6 to 8 years. So 30% of Americans say they have zero faith. And that's the way that a lot of people choose to go, right? Because I'm dealing with this hardship, this obstacle, this is difficult in my life. Why is this happening to me? Obviously, there's not a God, and if there is a God, I don't want to know him because he's allowed this to happen in my life. And so I choose the path of no faith. If you know somebody who's in that place, there's some great resources. There are some great books that are written. There are some great podcasts that address topics of evil, of suffering, of hurt, of pain, and how to work through those questions. And are there any answers? And there are. And they require faith. But so does the person who's living faithless, right? He's living, or she is living by faith as well. By faith that there is no God. But what do we do for those of us who are in a place in which we have chosen faith? We have chosen faith, and yet we're experiencing hardships, difficulty. What do we do in those circumstances in our life? Do we, in those moments, behave in the same way as those who are choosing the faithless path? And if we're really honest, many of us, that's what we do, right? Many of us grab the steering wheel of life. We buckle in when we experience those hardships, those difficulties. We grab the steering wheel and we take over our life and we choose to go in this particular direction. We attempt to define and to solve and to address whatever hardship that there is and to get away from it as quickly as we can in whatever way that we can come up with that will solve that problem. This is what we do. This is what people do. And this is what we're going to find this morning in the story of Abram. A man who we were introduced to last week as we began this series, a man who at 75 years old began a relationship with God. It was at 75 years old that God appeared to him and said, go, leave everything and go to this place. And Abraham chose to live by faith. He chose to believe that that voice that he was hearing was in fact the God of the universe, and he obeyed and he went. And where we left Abram last week was he had traveled through the land and he had built two different altars. And the last verse that we left him with, he built an altar and there he called on the name of the Lord. Abram was living by faith. Abram took big steps of faith. He had all kinds of questions and all kinds of challenges in life, but he chose to live by faith in that moment and be obedient, and he went. And he was calling on the name of the Lord. But what we're going to find in the story this week, in the very next verse, God is absent. And Abram takes the wheel of his life, and he became self-reliant. That's what people do when we're faithless, right? We become self-reliant. We become dependent upon ourself to solve our situation or problem, rather than looking to God to give wisdom and direction and help through our obstacle or hardship in life. We take the wheel of our life and we drive off in a particular direction. And when we become self-reliant, and this is what happened to Abraham, we're going to see this today. When he became self-reliant, he got himself in trouble. And the other thing that we're going to see today is that when we get ourselves in trouble, the thing about God is that he doesn't leave us in trouble. He comes after us, and he will provide a way out, and he will get us back on the path that he was leading and directing us to. But there's some things that we need to do in that process, and he will work it out. And why? Because God is faithful. We heard that this morning in the songs that we sang. God is faithful to his promises. God is faithful to what it is that he says that he's going to do. That's the synopsis of what it is that we're going to see this morning. So if you're here and you are struggling with faith and you are struggling with hardship and it may be an intense one, it may not be that deep of a one, but this is the question. Am I taking the steering wheel of my life and am I going off in my own direction, or am I building an altar and calling on the name of the Lord? That's the question. Where am I at in my life? And so let's pick up the story in Genesis chapter 12, looking and beginning at verse 10, right after we left Abram calling on the name of the Lord. And so here's what we see. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there just for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they will kill me, but will let you live. So say that you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Now, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians indeed saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. And he treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, menservant and maidservants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say a half-truth? She's my sister, so that I would take her to be my wife. Now then, here's your wife, take her and go. And then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. And so Abram, if you go into chapter 13, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and jumping over to verse 2, Abram had become very wealthy. Very interesting. And then in verse 3, and Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now, this is an interesting story following the preceding story. And if you're kind of reading along and you have in your mind and you remember what occurred in the preceding story, we know that God appeared to Abram and God promised to turn him into a great nation, right? And to have children come directly from his family line through his wife, Sarai. And if you're reading this along and you're understanding the complexity, or if you're just kind of figuring out what's going on here, okay, Abram gives his wife, Sarai, to the Pharaoh, you begin to go, uh-oh, the promise is in jeopardy right here, right? But let's start in the beginning. Let's start in the beginning, the very first phrase. Now, there was a famine in the land, and it's significant that we just pause and stop here for a second. No, there's a famine in the land. Remember last week we said that when we read the Old Testament, there's 5 little things to kind of keep in mind. Number 1, put yourself in the narrative. Put yourself in the story. Be one of the characters. Okay, I'm going to ask us to do that in just a second, that if you find yourself living in a famine, how are you going to respond? But the other thing that we said is when you read the Old Testament, when you read the Old Testament narrative, pay attention to things that seem to be odd, things that seem to stick out, things that seem to be repeated as well. And as you begin this initial phrase, now there was a famine in the land. That's it. That's the thing. That's what's sticking out. That phrase is the beginning of everything that then follows. It's an important phrase. It tells the reader to pay attention that everything that's about to follow is a direct result to the famine that's in the land. And so let's think about this for a second. Let's dig into what does it mean that there's a famine in the land? Well, we're living here in 2023 in the United States and perhaps never been to Israel and certainly not in 2000 BC to understand the topography of the land and how that shapes life in Israel. But I have a few images here for us to kind of get a picture, a snapshot of the nation of Israel from north to south, in particular along the eastern side of the country. You will find mountains. Mountains that butt up against the Mediterranean Sea. So this is a picture starting in northern Israel of Galilee. This is where Jesus is from, Nazareth of Galilee. You see a snapshot there of the Sea of Galilee, and that sea is very large. It's like a lake here in the United States. And so you see, the country is mountainous. The land is mountainous. And let's go to the next slide. And we see here, this is central Israel, south central Israel. Samaria is not too far out of Jerusalem. And again, we see mountains. And then the next slide, which gives us a picture of really a lot of the nation of Israel, has this desert area to it. And the desert region is a result of the topography of the land. And so when the rains would come, the rains would just, because of the location of the mountains, would pass over the nation, which is only 90 miles north to south and about 50 miles east to west. And the topography of the land creates situations in which the people living in this piece of the land would experience famine because there would be no rain for months and months and months. And so if you kind of think of some different stories that you read the Old Testament, you find that famine was an issue. So we're going to find, if you are reading through Genesis, and I encourage you to continue to do that as we go through the series, but you would be introduced to Abram's son Isaac, who also experienced a famine. Jacob, who also experienced a famine and went down into Egypt. You will remember stories of Elijah the prophet, famine in the land. Ruth, who with her mother-in-law, left the land because of famine, and just the topography of the land creates a life situation in which water doesn't come, crops don't grow, and you have no food. It hasn't been until irrigation and the figuring out of how to move water into the land that it makes possible to overcome these kinds of situations. But now put yourself in the story. You are Abram. You are a Sarai. You have no children. You are at this point in your life 75 and 65 years old, and you have a number of people and cattle, and you've required all of these things, and it's hot, and it's dry, and there's no food. What do you do? What do you do? I don't know that we've ever experienced those kinds of situations living in an abundant country like America, but this is the situation they find themselves in. And what are the basic needs of human beings? We all need food, water, shelter. And when you don't have food and you don't have water, you die. And so this is the scenario. So what do? Well, you got to figure out what to do. Right? You have to make some choices. You have to make some decisions. And so Abram and Sarah make a decision. They make a decision to go to Egypt. Now, why do they go to Egypt? Well, Egypt is notorious for having bountiful crops because of the Nile River. Interesting, in ancient Egyptian literature, even on tombstones, you find descriptions in which the Egyptians are recording that foreigners, and here's a quote from a tombstone, certain of the foreigners who know not how they may live have come. Their countries are starving. And so people all around the Middle East would come to Egypt because that is where you would find food when there was no rain. And so Abram knows that several hundred miles south is Egypt, and that's where food would be. So he makes this decision. Now, we live life, right? We find ourselves experiencing hardships and obstacles, and you don't just sit in the obstacle. That's not smart. That's not wise, right? God gives us a mind. He invites us to, and He expects us to engage and to think and to make wise decisions. But what's interesting here and what's glaringly obvious is that Abraham goes down to Egypt. He makes a decision, and who's not in the story? The Lord is not mentioned. Abram just makes this decision. He goes down to Egypt. He goes down to Egypt to get some food. Now, whenever you read in Scripture this going down, it is always connected with two things, a geographical thing and a spiritual thing. So geographically, mountainous Israel, you go down. Not only are you going down, you're going north to south. In this case, you see where Abram starts up in northern Israel and makes a journey several hundred miles south into Egypt. But there's also a spiritual component when we read in Scripture that people are going down that's always going away from God. So, for example, you find Jonah in Jonah chapter 1. It's just Jonah chapter 1, I think it's verse 8. And God appears to Jonah and says, I want you to go to the Assyrians, right? I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach the gospel. And Jonah, the text is really clear. Jonah runs away from God, and he goes down to Joppa to get on the boat to go to Tarshish. Over and over in Scripture, you see this. You go down, you're going away from God. You go up, you go towards God. And so we read in the Psalms, the ascent up into Jerusalem, the place that we're going to go, and we're going to meet with God. It's Moses who's invited up on the mountain to meet with God. Elijah, who's on the mountain, taking on the prophets of Baal. You go down into spiritual trouble, you go up into faith and relationship with God. So there's a famine in the land. Abram goes down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine is severe. Abraham is getting himself into trouble here. Abraham is making choices and decisions independent of consulting the Lord. The trouble he begins to find himself is after he travels for several hundred miles, he realizes, and perhaps he knew this before he even left, and he began to contemplate, how am I going to address the situation of coming as a foreigner into a new place, and they're going to see my wife. My wife is very beautiful. Some people say, well, how can you be beautiful at 65? Ladies, those of you who are older, you can be beautiful. Abraham here saw his wife as being beautiful. Not only did Abram see his wife as beautiful, but the Egyptians saw Abram's wife, Sarai, as beautiful, and they praised her to Pharaoh. See, Abram is beginning to contemplate, how am I going to deal with this? Because they're going to see my beautiful wife, they're going to take her, and they're going to kill me. This apparently was the practice in ancient Near East that if you wanted somebody else's wife, you could kill the man and take the wife. In this situation, if Sarai's not Abram's wife and just his sister, they're not going to kill him. They'll just take the wife, and Abram can live. Now, this is again another example of pay attention. This story is going to be repeated again and again. We find Abram doing the identical thing in just a few chapters in chapter 20. It's a different king, same scenario. He's afraid. One of these emotions that we have when we experience challenge and difficult things in life. Abram's afraid, so he begins to concoct a plan. He takes the wheel of his life. He becomes self-reliant rather than trusting in God. He makes up a way through it, the best way that he can. So he's going to starve to death, so he goes to Egypt. He gets to Egypt, he's going to die, so he makes up a plan. Again, God is not mentioned. And it's interesting, he says to his wife, do this for my sake. Now, Sarai agrees to this in some way, but really, Abram, I mean, when I read this, I'm like, this isn't for her sake, this is for your sake. Come on, this is another half-truth, right? I mean, say these things, say that you're my wife, so they won't kill me and you can live. But what is he doing? What is he saying to his wife? He's saying to his wife, you can go be with another man. Well, what kind of wife wants a husband who says, I'm not going to defend you, I'm not going to protect you, I'm not going to keep you as mine, I'm not going to be jealous of you, I'm going to just freely give you to somebody else so that I can live? It's not for her sake, it's for his sake. Now think of how Sarai must feel in this moment. Like, how does she feel as a woman? How does she feel as a wife? And what is Abram thinking, and what is he doing? And what about the promise that God is going to bless him and Sarai, and through Sarai birth a child, and now he's giving his wife to another man who will undoubtedly sleep with her, and perhaps a child be... What's going on? What are you thinking? But this is what we do, right? This is what we do when we find ourselves in difficult situations. We take the wheel of our life. We try and solve our problems. And it only gets us into trouble. When we are self-reliant, I think this is a big takeaway from this text, right? And this is a message that you're going to continue to see as you read through Genesis. When we are self-reliant, we get ourselves into trouble. When we forget about God, when we take the wheel of our life, we get ourselves into trouble. And so you may be a single young woman, and you want to be married, or a single young man, and you want to be in a relationship with a woman, and you find one who does not know or believe or have any faith in God. And you decide it doesn't matter, even though God is clear in saying, do not bind yourself to somebody who is not a believer, and you pursue the relationship, and ultimately into marriage you go. And you take the wheel of your life. The warning here is that as we do that, we are going to find ourselves in trouble. We find ourselves in difficult relationship with our spouse. And we've been married for a while, and things aren't going well, and we don't like him, and she doesn't like me, and I don't like her, and now I have to navigate this, and I made a promise till death do us part, but I really am not sure that I want to till death do us part, because she doesn't love me anymore, he doesn't love me anymore, I don't want to be in this relationship. And so we begin to concoct ideas and plans to deal with the difficulty and the hardship, and it's complex for sure. But we set off in our own direction, not consulting God. And it leads us to greater trouble. And I'm not minimizing the challenge or the difficulty of any of those things. And I'm not minimizing the challenge that Abram faces. He's going to die if he doesn't get any food. But how is he consulting God? How is he getting the voice of God in his life to give him wisdom and direction as he's making the choices that he's making? And he's not. He's depending on himself. He's being self-reliant. And he's gotten himself into trouble. And thus, as a listener, as a reader who's reading the story, I said this earlier, right? You're like, what about the promise? What's going to happen to the promise? Can Abraham screw this up that bad that's going to mess up what God promised? I mean, there's a bit of anxiety as a reader as you're reading this. It's like, no, don't do this. You're messing everything up that God promised to you. And in that moment, just as you're about to get to that place, God, the name of the Lord, appears in the text. This is the first time the Lord appears in this part of the story. In this story. And it's not because Abram's consulting him, it's because God inserts himself into the story. And this is who God is, right? God does not allow us to just wander away from him. If we are followers of him, he will hound us down. He will pursue us. He will keep speaking to us. We can keep denying. We can keep shutting him out. We can keep choosing to disobey and be sinful, but he will stay after us. And our life will continue to spiral down further and further and further. But he will keep after us until eventually we relent and turn back to him. And that's what we see happening here. And so, it's so fascinating to see that Abram says to Sarai, hey, do all this so that I will be treated well for your sake, that my life is going to be spared. And then the next thing you see in the text is that actually happens. His life is spared, and he's treated well, and now he finds himself in a really complicated situation because he gave his wife up, probably not thinking that Pharaoh was going to be the one that would come after his wife. But now that Pharaoh has taken his wife, there's no easy way out. So this is how complicated the situation has become. Not only is it Pharaoh, but Pharaoh has blessed him, and he's given him all this stuff. And so Abraham has really made it out well, but he doesn't have his wife. And so God inserts himself in the story. He inflicts all these diseases. And then he sends him away. And what we find at the end of the story is that Abram now has turned back to God, right? God has provided a way back to him. And so I wrote these notes. I wrote this in my notes. I said, we can never wander beyond the reach of God. There's always a way back. It's the way of repentance and confession of our sinful mistakes, and then receiving God's forgiveness and setting out again on that righteous path back to God, right? And so 1 John tells us that if we say that we have no sin, we're kidding ourselves. But if we confess our sin, God is faithful and just. He'll forgive us our sins. He'll cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So with God, failure, wandering away from Him, is never an unforgivable sin that keeps us so distant from Him. There's no mistake, there's no sin that's so big that's unredeemable. No, God provides a way back if we repent and confess. So, remember that young man, that text I received, and so I responded to that text and gave my information, and that young man, he texted me. And I met with him last Sunday night. Complete stranger. No idea who this young guy was. He came through the doors, the office doors down there, and we sat on Sunday night, and he poured out his heart of confession and said, I never really have been a follower of God, but I have messed things up so bad. This week, I've turned to Him, and I'm here because I need massive help. He recounted all kinds of things that he's been involved in and has done, and how trust has been deeply broken in his young marriage of only a couple of months, and how his years and years and years and years of addiction and behavior has created all kinds of mess. And it's a big mess. Indeed, it's a big mess. But he's at a place in life now where he's humbled and he's broken and he's confessing his sin. He sent me this email in the middle of the week. He said, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your time, your energy, and the wisdom during a very challenging time in my life. Obstacle in his life. It means a great deal to me. You have shared words of encouragement and some resources to help me on a righteous path. Listen to this. I am surrendering myself to the Lord, and I could not be happier to be typing that right now. I think we have a good plan and a clear path forward. I will be joining some groups as well as sharing with my wife the resources that could be helpful for her. She and I both have our own individual relationship to grow with Jesus, and then we can point our relationship towards Jesus collectively. Thank you so much. You see, God will come after us, and He will get us back on the path. But we have to be at a place in which we're willing to receive His work in our life. Finally, the last thing from this story I just want to pull out, and it's this. It's God patiently works out His plan no matter our self-reliance. And what's fascinating about this story is that God's the hero, right? God is the one who does the work. He's the one who's bringing out His plan. He's working out His plan. And what's so interesting about this story is this is a foreshadowing of what is about to come in the nation of Israel. So Abram, in some ways, foreshadows what's about to happen through all the people that are going to come through him. See, Abram goes off and he's self-reliant. God steps in and delivers. Abram, self-reliant, goes to Egypt. God steps in, delivers. It's a fascinating story. Go to the next slide, please. This kind of shows the picture of the similarities between Abram and the nation of Israel 400 years later. So there's a famine in the land, and so it's going to be Abram's grandsons and great-grandsons, 70 in all, who will go to Egypt. Abram did the same thing. They will descend into Egypt, and when they're in Egypt, there's going to be an attempt to kill the men, just like there's an attempt to kill Abram. And then God's going to send plagues, just like He did to Pharaoh of Egypt in Abram's time. He's going to do the same thing in the nation, to Egypt, when the whole nation is there. And then God is going to give them, the whole nation, all kinds of gifts, and they are going to pillage Egypt as they leave, and God is going to deliver them miraculously as God delivered Abram miraculously, and then they're going to ascend up into the nation of Israel, to the Negev, up to where God has called them to. It's a fascinating foreshadowing that happens, and this must be a huge encouragement to the nation of Israel when they find themselves in that situation that their great-grandfather Abram lived through this. God, even though he was self-reliant, even though he went off in his own way, God provided a way back, and God preserved the promise. And as you keep reading through the Old Testament, you will see this over and over and over again. So I'm going to invite our worship team to come on up, and as they come, just 3 questions for us. As we think of the 3 main points this morning, when we are self-reliant, we get ourselves into trouble. I just ask you to think of this question. Are you being self-reliant in the hardship that you're experiencing in life? You're experiencing something challenging. You're experiencing something difficult. We all do. In that situation, how am I being self-reliant? Am I petitioning God? Am I calling on God? Am I seeking God? Or am I living faithless and living self-reliant instead? How am I doing that? Secondly, are you in trouble? Are you in trouble right now? Are you in trouble? Are you feeling like you are so distant, so far from God? Things are so messed up, the choices that you've made. I invite you to confess. Just confess your sin to God. And then seek help. Don't stay there on your own. Seek help. You need other people in your life to assist and to help you as you work through this. And then lastly, are you waiting? And this is the really hard part, right? Sometimes we find ourselves in these really difficult and hard things, and you're petitioning God and you're asking God, get me out of this situation. I don't know my way out, and please get me out of this situation. And some of you in these health situations right now, this is where you're at. Like, God, get me out. In these relational issues, God, get me out. And God isn't getting you out right now. Can you be patient? Will you be patient? Maybe that's what God's inviting you to this morning. Be patient. Keep trusting. Have faith. I was faithful to Abram. It took a while for the plan to work out. I'm going to be faithful to you. Will you wait on me? Putting your faith in me day in and day out. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but just trust. Because when you get to it tomorrow, eventually, I will bring you out.
Just stand with us. Let's make this last song our heart's response. This is our prayer.